Persephone Foundation Field Report, Supplementary, Soviet Union. Alright, going over some more of these files, we have a little bit more of a detailed picture on the Soviet Union of Para-Echoes, and it's a very interesting picture we have painted for us. Now, as in our own timeline, the Soviet Union was founded in 1917 after the Russian Revolution, which ousted the Tsar. Now currently, as in our own timeline, it is a trade and military alliance of various independent states, all united under a communist policy. Again, this is a military alliance, but with open trade and travel between member state citizens. Membership, as our own timeline, is made up of the United Soviet Socialist Republics, including Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarusian SSR, Estonian SSR, Georgian SSR, Kazakh SSR, Kyrgyz SSR, Latvian SSR, Lithuanian SSR, Moldavian SSR, Russian SFSR, Tajik SSR, Turkmen SSR, Ukrainian SSR, and the Uzbek SSR. There is also the Warsaw Pact, which contains Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Finland, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. Allied states outside of the Warsaw Pact include Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Iran, Iraq, the Ivory Coast, Laos, Liberia, North Korea, North Vietnam, Sierra Leone, Syria, Uruguay, and what we can presume are the remnants of the People's Liberation Army in China. The Cybernetic Federation is also considered a part of the Soviet Union, including Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay. Now, as in our own timeline, the Soviet Union also supplies multiple rebel forces across the world, including the Red Army factions of Europe and Asia, the Movement for International Revolution, or MIR, which is primarily active as we found in South and Central America, the Phoenix Front, which appears to be a rough analog to the IRA and UDA of Northern Ireland in our own timeline, the Viet Cong, the Yugoslav Partisan Army, several cells of the Confederate Revolutionaries, which is interesting, but we will touch more on why this is interesting in our Confederate report, and they also have indirect contacts with something called the Network. We don't know what the Network is, but given the fact that they have to maintain indirect contact, it may indicate that the Soviets see them more as a pawn than an actual allied group. Now, as in our own timeline, the USSR guides the bloc's movements. Its current leader is Sima Lem Davidova. She was a general, soon field marshal, during World War III, and was found to be a capable commander both against the Allied nations and Empire of the Rising Sun. Now, after the betrayal by Cherdenko, Davidova was appointed by the Supreme Soviet of the Russian SFSR to become premier in his absence. Now, Davidova has since embarked on a massive reform crusade trying to bring in line the Soviet Union with actual communist policies. Now, at present, unlike what many Americans may think, the Soviet Union is not just the USSR and all the states under it. In fact, Davidova has made an effort to try and break any kind of appearance of puppet states under the Soviet Union. It does not consider itself an empire, but it still does possess the surveillance systems in place from previous premiers, which so far include Stalin and Cherdenko. Lenin, as we've found, has had little impact on the Para-Echo Soviet Union outside of its formation. One of the bigger issues confronting Davidova is trying to shift the Soviet Union away from a wartime economy to a more civilian product-focused economy. However, this is proving difficult as several trouble spots in the world keep the Union from fully disarming itself. Now, there are no supranational bodies within the Soviet Union. However, there are hints that Davidova wants to replicate some of the successes the Allies have had with groups like ASIN and the Allied Nations Parliament. But there are several major forces within the Soviet Union, including the communist parties of various member states, the Red Army, and of course the KGB. Now, there are several goals Davidova does want to carry out, the primary being to ensure the survival of the Soviet Union. After World War III, the Union was essentially left in a shambles thanks to the efforts of the Allied nations and Empire of the Rising Sun. However, if the Union does survive, it can carry on to its second goal, which is to continue to spread communism through all nations. A subset of this goal appears to be to move communism more heavily into Africa. Already there are several communist nations in West Africa. The hope is that it can continue to spread, capitalizing on rebel movements within the continent. Finally, and possibly most importantly, Davidova wants to move from a Stalinist political viewpoint to a more mainstream communist principle governing the Soviet Union states. However, there are several current conflicts the Union is involved in, primarily the USSR Atomic Kingdom War. The Chinese Atomic Kingdom, as mentioned, is at war with anyone on their border, which includes the United Soviet Socialist Republics. However, for our purposes, this includes essentially all of the Soviet Union, as several member states have volunteered forces to aid the Russians in the region. Now, at present, they are also involved in a conflict against the Global Liberation Army in the region controlled by the Arabian Socialist Government and multiple southern Soviet Socialist republics. They do have multiple non-combat advisors in the Vietnam War and in the Korean border conflict. They have a heavy presence on the Iron Curtain and primarily in the Berlin garrison. They have multiple combat advisors in Africa among several rebel groups, and they also have non-combat advisors within the Federation to observe their progress. The Soviets appear to be pleased with the Federation. However, it is noted that the Soviets do not consider the Federation to be on their level militarily as of yet. Now, there are multiple strengths to the Soviet Union, of course, the first being the large production capabilities of the Union itself. Each member state can not only rely on their own manufacturing, but they can undoubtedly rely on Russian factories for almost all of their needs. They also have population, of course, with Russia alone having a larger population than most Eastern European nations, to say nothing of most Western European nations. Now, civilian loyalty among the Soviet Union is also at an all-time high. Russians especially are pleased with Davydova's reforms after the train wreck that was the Chudenko premiership, and especially after the harsh rule that was under Stalin. It also has various deconstructed borders. Essentially, all borders between member states are full and open, allowing trade and travel to proceed unimpeded so long as the proper paperwork is filed and completed. Now, when it comes to engineering, the Soviets are masters. The Allies are the kings of the theoretical, but the Soviets rule engineering, and they especially have a strong presence in magnetic technologies. They have several systems of drones which can act fully automated on their own on the battlefield, and they are found to be experts at utilizing systems created by none other than Nikola Tesla himself. Where in our own timeline Tesla was little more than a crackpot, here in the Terra Echoes timeline, Tesla appears to have been the genius. All others have to follow. As in our own timeline, they currently lead the space race by a wide margin. In terms of development, all member states, or at least nearly all member states, appear to be on a similar level. And when it comes to war, they are experts at land war, primarily combined arms strategies and tactics. There are, of course, multiple weaknesses, however. First is entrenched corruption. It seems that Davydova's reforms, while popular with the people, have struck many Soviet leaders as being too much too fast. There are heavy resistance forces from Stalinist and Chudenko loyalists still in power. There is also a matter of uneven force. Militarily, many member states cannot say they have the same raw power as the Russian military. It is also felt that the Soviet military doctrine itself is inflexible, as it relies on focusing all forces around the actions of various heavy assets within the force itself. Also, several of the member states within the Union are considered unreliable allies at best, especially with fractures in the Warsaw Pact centered around Poland and Finland over political issues. Now, it does seem also that in the Terra Echoes timeline, after World War II, that many Eastern European states were able to break free of the Soviet Union. Our information, it appears, was shoddy at best. It turns out that multiple member states of the Eastern European bloc, controlled under Stalin, were indeed set free after World War II, only to be recaptured during World War III under Chudenko's advances. However, after World War III, hopes for an Allied liberation were dashed, and presently several resistance movements exist within the Soviet states in Eastern Europe under the Warsaw Pact. Finally, there is of course the dark legacy of the purges by Stalin and in fact Chudenko. Now, of course, Stalin's purges of his generals is nothing new in either history, but apparently Chudenko made a massive purge of Soviet research into psionic abilities, which were later capitalized on by the Empire of the Rising Sun. Now the Soviets are in a desperate catch-up game to try and make up the ground they've lost compared to the Allies' current research into the phenomena. Now, we do have several comments on these issues. The first being that it seems that the Soviets are sending an almost inordinate amount of troops and material to the Chinese front. Even with the capabilities of the Chinese to replicate and clone their forces, the forces we are seeing here being sent off to China are almost phenomenally large compared to what should be needed. Also, more interestingly, they appear to have actually functioning communist governments. And I know that may seem like an almost cruel joke at the expense of those who believe in communism, But in Para Echoes, it does appear that communism can function, compared to in our own timeline, where communism was of course hamstrung by madmen, dictators, and simple human fallacies. We do not know how this is possible. Human fallacy alone should account for some problems, and indeed it does, but we're seeing functionality on a level unheard of in our own timeline. Now, it's also noted that communism spread much farther than our own timeline. It appears that here, communism may still have a life. Now, relationships between the Allied member states and Soviet member states are relatively open as well. The Soviets do not speak for each other. Multiple states, in fact, speak for themselves, the most prominent apparently being Romania. However, there is still note of the Gulag system being in effect, well into the 1960s, long after the program should have been shut down. We can find no notice of Davidova trying to shut the program down. In fact, under her reign, it still appears to be going very strong. Now, finally, we have many Allied documents here mentioning Mongolia and Siberia, but also heavily redacted. We may be able to find possible information on the so-called robot armies, cults, and alien sightings within several Soviet archives. We will try and move agents in place. However, our problem is that we have not located an agent capable of disguising themselves as a Soviet citizen as of yet. We will try our best to do what we can. Field team signing out until next report.